Hi, my name is Ken Davidian, and welcome to Season 2 of Organization Theory in Space. In this season, I'm making one video for every chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Organizational Change and Innovation, second edition, edited by Marshall Scott Poole and Andy Van de Ven. This video covers Chapter 18 of the Handbook, entitled Evolutionary Dynamics of Organizational Populations and Communities. And this is a monster of a chapter. This chapter is 3 times longer than any other chapter in the book. In this video, we'll attempt to cover all the material, and the video could easily be 60 minutes long, but I'm going to make it as concise as possible. And even though this video is going to be longer than normal, I'm going to try to still keep it to under 15 minutes. We'll start with some basic definitions, and then we'll introduce the dual hierarchy framework of the genealogical and ecological organizational entities and their interactions and replication processes. Next, we'll dive into the micro-evolutionary processes, the macro-evolutionary processes, and we'll finish with the interaction of micro and macro processes together. This is a really interesting and exciting material, so let's get started. As is often the case, we need to start with some basic definitions. An organizational population is a local, co-evolving grouping of organizations that embody the same organizational form. An organizational community is a functionally integrated system of interacting organizational populations. 2 other terms are used in this chapter that are also important. Commensalism is defined as competition and cooperation between similar units, or the coaction of like forms. Symbiosis, on the other hand, is a mutual interdependence between dissimilar units, 2 unlike organizational forms working together. The evolution motor is characterized by 2 processes of replication and interaction. These are connected by 2 hierarchies, genealogical and environmental. The interaction processes occur within the ecological hierarchy, comprised of the environment and split into the typical levels within organizations, including jobs, work groups, and the level of organization, and the level of multiple organizations, including populations, communities, and ecosystems. The replication processes occur within the genealogical hierarchy, including routines and competences that define an organization, and the superorganizational levels of organizational forms and polyphyletic groupings. In general, the evolution motor involves the simultaneous processes of blind variation, competitive selection, and retention, operating to increase the fitness of all organizations at all levels. It is common to abbreviate variation, selection, and retention to simply VSR. The VSR processes occur within and across all levels of both the genealogical and ecological hierarchies. It is processes within the ecological hierarchy that constrain the variation and retention of evolution occurring within the genealogical hierarchy. The rates of evolution are generally faster at the lower levels, and so the higher levels tend to constrain the evolutionary processes at the lower levels. Finally, there's an inherent tension between the retention and variation forces. One result is that organizational fitness at any given level is not necessarily better at higher levels. Another is that too much retention overly constrains the amount of variation that can occur, and too much variation results in not taking full advantage of retained changes. New organizational forms can be characterized by their set of core and peripheral features. The core features include the stated goals, authority relations, core technology, and market strategy. The peripheral features include the number and sizes of subunits, the number of hierarchical levels, the span of control, the patterns of communication, and buffering mechanisms. Core features are convenient for analytic purposes because they are relatively stable and significant distinctions between organizational forms. The evolutionary forces of variation and selection predominate within the genealogical hierarchy. Most variations serve to perpetuate the existing form rather than disrupt it. Intra-organizational sources of variation include institutional experimentation, such as internal R&D, direct and indirect direct incentives to produce variations, such as suggestion boxes or continuous improvement programs, and unfocused variation, such as playfulness. This involves the allowance of slack resources to conduct informal work on unapproved activities. It turns out that internal criteria to select variations are more relevant to people within organizations than the external or environmental selection criteria. Internal variation is typically driven by core organizational features like stated goals. External forces that select variations, on the other hand, tend to be less predictable, and variations are perceived as experiments. External sources of variation include interorganizational learning through strategic alliances, research consortia, and identification of best practices. Best practices can reflect three different modes, including frequency imitation, which is imitating the most common practices, trait imitation, which is imitating the practices of an organization that is, for example, the biggest or the most successful, or has some other trait, and outcome imitation, imitating the most successful practices. Selection involves three main processes to define criteria and organizational fitness landscapes. The first is competitive isomorphism, where organizations compete when niches of critical resources overlap. Two processes work to select out the variation of organizational forms. The first are stabilizing selection forces that result in organizational specialization, or directive selection that forces organizations toward some optimum fit within an environmental landscape. The second process is diversifying or disruptive selection, which forces organizations toward the tails of an organizational fit distribution. An example of this is when big, medium, and small hotels compete within the smaller niches. The medium hotel competes against bigger and smaller hotels for niche fit, and a common result is that the ultimate survival of the bigger and smaller hotels persist, and the medium-sized hotels don't. The second process is institutional isomorphism, recognizing the coercive, normative, and mimetic forces in institutions. The third process is called the RK transition, and it's based on the logistic population growth functions from bioecology. R is the natural growth rate of an organizational population. N is the number of organizations in the population. K is the carrying capacity, or the maximum number of organizations that can exist within the population, and T is the time interval. A detailed description of the transition process is beyond the scope of this video, and I'd encourage you to read the chapter to get all the details, but technological evolution is a driving force of this transition. Competence-enhancing technology changes favor a class of organizations called K-strategists, large generalist organizations making efficiency improvements based on the new technology. Competence-destroying technology, on the other hand, favor a class of organizations called R-strategists, smaller organizations that can move quickly to take advantage of the disruptive environment created by the technology. The inheritance processes of organizations are seemingly more complex than biological inheritance, since sources of variation are introduced from multiple sources at multiple times during the life of the organization. This is the difference between Lamarckian inheritance, where inherited and acquired traits can both be passed on from one generation to the next, versus Mendelian inheritance, where only inherited traits can be passed along. There's a focus on barriers to change, or segregating mechanisms that allow different organizational forms to remain distinct over time. These segregating mechanisms include technological interdependencies, transaction costs, collective action, institutional processes, social, professional, and personal network closures, complexity of and resistance to learning, conformist transmission, and imprinting. Examples of each of these is given in the book. These are the mechanisms that restrict the retention of selected variations in organizational evolution. Now we turn our focus to macro-level evolutionary dynamic processes, the way that communities emerge from the interaction of multiple populations. Unlike the field of organization theory in bioecology, the idea of a superorganism is not well accepted. Unfortunately, in org theory, this area of study is not well researched. An example of communities include regions called Silicon Valley in California and Route 128 in Cambridge. After the book describes how communities evolve in detail, it then talks about how the structure of communities, beginning with the logistics equation we showed a couple of slides ago. The equation is expanded to model the existence of two interacting communities and then generalized to include an indeterminate number of communities. That's the third equation on the right. Basically, the equation stays the same except for the inclusion of a population interdependence coefficient, alpha. Alpha AB is the effect of population A on the population B, and alpha BA is the effect of population B on population A. There's no reason why alpha AB needs to be the same as alpha BA, and in fact, there are 6 different scenarios of commensalism, or levels of competition, between populations depending on the different alpha values, as shown in the table. If both coefficients are greater than 0, where the presence of population A negatively affects population B and vice versa, then that represents the case of full competition. Partial competition is represented by the case when population A negatively affects population B, but population B has no effect on population A. And predatory competition is the case when the presence of A negatively affects population B and the presence of B actually benefits population A. Partial mutualism occurs when one population benefits from the presence of the other, but the other is unaffected. Full mutualism occurs when both populations benefit from the presence of each other, and total neutrality occurs when neither population is affected by the presence of the other. This section closes with some words of caution, stating that just because a community is highly functional, that does not mean it is necessarily stable, mutualistic, or ordered. Neo-institutionalists theorize that speciation occurs, or new organizational forms are created, by entrepreneurs recombining existing routines and competencies based on something called vicarious selectors, selection criteria the entrepreneurs think are correct based on their experiences or beliefs. Vicarious selectors are not truly blind to outcomes, and they are not necessarily correct. In any case, based on whether entrepreneurs are changing one or more of the core features of an organization, the new type of organizational form will fall into one of the 4 cells shown in table 18.2. Strong speciation occurs if all 4 organizing elements are changed, and weak speciation occurs if only 1 or 2 organizing elements are changed. New communities can emerge when selection pressures are weak. This is a situation called ecological opportunity, and it is required for successful speciation. Community disruption can occur with the presence of 2 destabilizing forces: technology cycles and institutional dynamics. Technological discontinuities can open entrepreneurial opportunities, freeing up resources that reinforce competitive positions. Competence-destroying technologies transform resource exchange and power relationships, which allows new relationships to form. Institutional dynamics involves the emergence of a non-dominant institutional logic to supplant the previously dominant institutional logic. Institutional changes can result in many different outcomes, including new logics, new actors, new meanings, new relations among actors, modified population boundaries, and modified community boundaries. One of the most important factors for any macro-organizational form to be retained is the legitimation of institutional logic, technology, and values of the new form. Legitimacy includes cognitive and socio-political forms. Cognitive legitimacy is the taken for grantedness of the new form, and socio-political legitimacy, how embedded the new form is in the relational and normative institutional contexts. Table 18.3 shows 4 levels of legitimacy building, ranging from trust, reliability, reputation, and finally, socio and political and cognitive legitimacy. Social movements can play a critical role in creating new organizational forms, usually as a result of 3 types of organizational and market failures. Influence costs, as exemplified by the creation of clubs in the US in the early 1900s to legitimize the use of the automobile, is the first. Positive externalities, such as the example of standards creation to stimulate the externality of free riding, of new organizations is the second, and negative externalities when market mechanisms don't work because the transactions span large distances, the victims are uninformed, or they don't have recognized legal rights is the third. The example given in the book is about the creation of better business bureaus to stop false advertising in this case. Finally, the book concludes with a diagram showing how the different types of interactions occur within and between the two hierarchies and the different levels of each hierarchy. This is a map of how many of the concepts that were discussed in the chapter fit together. In the genealogical view, retention processes affect the variation processes at levels above and below it. In the ecological hierarchy, selection processes trickle downward while features retained at the lower levels can appear at higher levels. Clearly, this view is highly complicated, and this complication is one of the reasons for conflicting selection pressures across levels. This means that what is good at one level might not be desirable at other adjacent levels. Well, like I said, this was a super long video and a super complicated set of concepts, but I hope you enjoyed it. I think this is really, really important stuff, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you did, please consider hitting the subscribe button or the notification bell so you can always be alerted when a new video is released. Thanks. OT in Space was produced by IRL, which stands for Impossible Research LLC. IRL conducts process research on the topics of innovation and industry emergence within the space sector context. IRL also offers services of organization theory consulting, research consulting, and STEAM outreach. This video is intended for educational purposes only.